we in the legal services sector, as I think you know, have been exploring how to help regulators in our sector to become more consumer focused, and how to understand what consumer focused regulation really looks like, and how in particular they can learn from other sectors, because we've all got quite a lot to learn from each other. And I know that each of you have got sort of really some good stories to tell about things that you've done in your sector which have improved things, perhaps areas where you'd like to do a bit more. Helen, can I just start with you?
The example I think I would give is the consumer duty, whereby firms must act to deliver good outcomes for consumers. I mean, it's underpinned by some general principles around acting in good faith towards their retail customers, avoiding foreseeable harm for their customers, and enabling and supporting effective decision-making by consumers. And by that I mean enabling them to pursue their financial objectives. The panel advocated very strongly for a board champion on the boards of firms that were implementing the consumer duty. The idea being that if the consumer duty was to succeed, there needed to be a really strong cultural change within these firms.
So that's really, really useful. Gillian, can I just come on to you? I know you're at Citizens Advice, you have a particular duty to represent the interests of energy consumers.
We really see the interconnectedness of people's problems, and that informs the advocacy solutions we put forward. A good example of this was the issue around the force fitting of prepayment meters, which captured a lot of press, politician and regulator attention last year. That was following the publication of a report from us in January, and then the Times investigation in February. It showed that prepayment meters were being installed in households where there was significant risk of disconnection. So we had been raising problems about this with Ofgem for many months before this. We first did a policy referral about 8-9 months earlier, when it became clear from the client contacts we were receiving that the existing consumer protection framework was starting to break down as a result of the cost of living crisis. So as a result, Ofgem did come through and put some additional protections in place, but I think they'd also admit that they didn't sufficiently heed the warnings that we had been giving them. And in terms of what good looks like in this space, I think you need regulators that are ready and committed to listening to the views of consumer advocates.
And it often takes a news story or something to make people listen, and a good regulator will listen quickly. The good news is that perhaps they're beginning to do that.
I would think so. I think they'd respond differently.
Mike, at Consumer Council for Water, you do an awful lot of dealing with complaints, consumer complaints.
Yeah, I mean, people come to us if they've exhausted the complaint process between themselves and the companies. And we've done a couple of things over the last 6 months to get ourselves closer to the customer and actually get even more insight from that process. So the first thing was that we've taken over the ADR contract. Before, from a customer point of view, you wouldn't resolve your complaint with your water company. You'd then come to us, and we would sort of mediate and be the kind of working on behalf of customers to try and find a resolution. Then they could go to ADR. So there's all these steps in the process. Now we've taken that contract in-house, we're letting that contract. It means it's slick, seamless for the customer. Two, we get then extra insight from the ADR step that we weren't getting before. So that's really good. But the other thing we've done is we've reinvented our complaint assessments. Go into water companies and do a deep dive, send a team in, do a deep dive on complaints.
Do you dive into water issues?
You would dive into it. It's a swirling whirlpool of issues. But by doing that, you're not just being walked through a bunch of complaints that you pick at random. You learn so much more about the culture of the company. Now, you've talked about culture, Helen, from a boardroom level. Now, by doing the complaints assessment, you get to see culture at the grassroots level. Yeah. And for all this stuff to be effective, it's got to be throughout the depth of the organization. And going back to the regulatory side of this, we've been keeping Ofwat in the loop, you know, what we're hearing from this, because it is about getting that intel and then using it effectively to secure a change. Everyone wants to be a superhero and put their cape on and solve a problem once it's a big problem. It shouldn't be like that. We should be spotting the problems when they're small and preventing them from ballooning into the big consumer issues that are going to hit the news. But of course, that's less exciting for some people. But we need to change the mindset so that we're nipping things in the bud.
The example that I was going to use of an approach that we've taken within the aviation industry, leads on beautifully from what Mike was just saying. So we've been looking particularly at innovation and new technologies, and in the aviation sector, in the jargon, AAM, advanced air mobility. So things like flying taxis and, you know, those sorts of things. But looking at it right from the start to make sure that consumers are built into all of the planning, because they don't exist yet. Actually making sure that as the regulation is developed, that the consumer principles are absolutely baked in right from the start. So we did really interesting piece of work with the team in the Civil Aviation Authority, in the Sandbox team, looking at we developed a sort of a toolkit for inventors and designers when they're talking to the CAA about their new technology and what they want to do, which lays out the consumer principles and the questions that they need to be asking themselves as they're developing their products and their services. Have they thought about how that people with particular issues would still be able to access the services? And thinking about it right from the beginning, because it's so much harder to retrofit that onto a service that's already been developed. When they're then shaping regulation for these new technologies and these new innovative approaches, the consumers are built right in from the very, very start.
Yes, this is very much consumer-focused regulation
Totally.
by design, from the earliest design stage.
Exactly.
Something that regulators traditionally haven't done very well, but it's a really good example to think about.
And another sort of follow-up to that is the register. You go to the register and you check authorisation. The Financial Conduct Authority's register is heavily skewed really towards the financial services sector. So for a consumer to actually go and check whether the firm they're dealing with or the individual they're dealing with is authorised is very, very difficult, because it's full of technical jargon. There are various steps that you have to go through. It's not always clear. The panel have been working very closely with the FCA around a redesign of retrofitting, a redesign of the register to enable it to be more accessible to consumers. And sort of consumer testing is key.
I think there are two things in particular that I have taken away from this conversation, along with lots of other messages. The first is the need to be talking much more regularly with other sectors, and that should be the regulators as well as the consumer panels, in order to make sure that we're really learning from each other. And the other thing, which is quite a common theme, is about the need to get in very early when you're designing a policy. Get in early with your consumer principles, make sure it's done properly. So I think that's been a really useful couple of lessons.